Hello, my name is Marianne Moore, and I work at the Virginia Department of Education in the Division of Special Education and Student Services.
My name is Liz Getzel. I'm at the Virginia Commonwealth University Rehabilitation Research and Training Center, and we have a contract with the VDOE to create the database for Indicator 14 data collection.
For some time now, we have really focused on writing good transition IEPs. Through the Virginia Transition Outcome Project and the technical assistance provided by the Training and Technical Assistance Centers, IEP writing has been focused on, and we have seen steady improvement. In fact, statewide, our Indicator 13 data is consistently well over 90%. IEPs are important, but implementing and providing transition services that get results are also important. As we consider methods and practices that get good outcomes, we should focus on our Indicator 14 data. Your transition TTACs, or transition specialists, I should say, at the Training and Technical Assistance Centers have received professional development on a particular logic model that will help you tie your efforts to results. This webcast is designed to get you started looking at your Indicator 14 data.
We want to talk today about several things during our time together. I think it's important that we review how to access your Indicator 14 reports. I know that I get a number of questions about that from school divisions, so we want to make sure that you understand how to access those on your school division website for better use of the data that's being collected. We want to discuss what types of data are available in terms of the reports that are on your website, and we will be looking at a few samples of that today to give you an idea of how the data can be used. It's really important, and this will be talked about throughout this webcast, is about how your indicator is calculated. I know there's been some confusion about the actual Indicator 14 data that is submitted to the federal government February 1st of each year and what the data on your database. For example, I will talk about that when we talk about employment in particular, so that you understand how Indicator 14 is really pulled from the data that you're collecting. It's like almost a subset of the overall information that you are providing. And we want to, most importantly, discuss strategies on how data can be used for local programming decisions. One piece of information to really bear in mind is that for small school divisions, how you determine you are going to report out your data is very critical, since you are dealing with smaller numbers and you want to make sure that the data that you are presenting to the public or using for program decisions aren't something that makes it transparent as to who these individuals might be. So when we talk about a cell size or a response, if you will, to a particular question is 10 or less, that should not be reported out in the sense that they could be identifiers as to who's in higher ed or who's in employment. So we want to make sure that for the smaller school divisions that you look very carefully at what your data is and make sure that when you are reporting out that it is done in such a way that it does not identify individuals who may be in your database. Let's review how to access your Indicator 14 data to make sure that everyone understands the process to obtain the reports that are on your website that you can easily access. I'm sure many of you are familiar with our worksupport.com address, because that's how this is the same address you use when you input your data. And you will come to the login page, and then you will type in your division's administrator code. And the administrator code is sent to those individuals identified as the contacts for receiving information from us during the Indicator 14 process. And then once on the site, you will click on See Frequency Response Report. Let's look at what that is on the website. So we've typed in the worksupport.com indicator 14 web address, and you are now at the point where you are typing in, this is the login page, and you're typing in the information, which is your passcode, your administrator passcode, so that you will see the reports. As you can see, when you first are entering data and you're not using the administrator passcode, you really see add survey data for a new student or see survey completion report. So those are the reports that you are entering as you're collecting the data. Once you type in the administrator passcode, you now see two other areas. See survey response frequency report, and this report gives you in real time, meaning as you're entering the data, gives you in real time what your indicator 14 data looks like. So that will always, if you want to see how things are going with your data entry, you can always click on your survey response frequency report and see that. Remember that indicator 14 that is submitted to the federal government has very specific definitions as to how we then analyze the data after it's all completed. It is a hierarchy in terms of how data is organized. It is the percent of youth who are no longer in secondary school had IEPs in effect at the time they left school. So when we talk about students who are no longer in secondary school, that can include dropouts who possibly drop out in 9th grade. So you are looking at individuals from 9th grade through 12th or beyond in terms of once they leave and at the time that they leave, they are on an IEP. So the first definition for indicator 14 is enrolled in higher education within 1 year of leaving high school. So anyone who checks yes that they've been in higher ed, they've completed a semester, they will then be calculated in the enrolled in higher ed. The second one that is enrolled in higher ed or competitive employment, and there are very specific definitions for competitive employment that we'll talk about in just a moment. But those two numbers are added together for that second part of the indicator. And the third part really takes higher ed, your competitive employment number, if they've been involved in post-secondary education, which also has other post-secondary education and training, which also has a specific definition, or other employment once you are leaving high school. And what's important to understand is that indicator 14, the information that you're entering onto the database, is really a subset of the total information that you're collecting. So you will be able to look at your indicator 14 data, and on your frequency report that we just looked at in terms of the arrow pointing to clicking on that, we give you a non-duplicated count, so you can see how many specifically are in higher ed, how many are specifically meeting the competitive employment, and then how many are in post-secondary education or training or other employment. Then when we calculate the indicator, if you remember, I sent out tables to everyone that looked at what your indicator 14 data was, compare your LEA indicator percentages compared to the state target. So I think that it's just really important to bear in mind that there's a lot of data on your indicator 14 site that goes really beyond the indicator 14 numbers that are being submitted. What I also want to point out is you have an option on your database for legacy data, and that data is the last 4 years, 2007 to 2010. You need to remember that in 2010, the definitions changed for indicator 14. So your 2010 data collection and your current 2011 data that you just completed are the only 2 years that you can really compare your indicators, because they are based on the same definitions. 2007 8, and 9 were under different definitions. So if you look at your indicators numbers prior to 2010, it's really comparing apples with oranges because they function under different definitions. So you do now have 2 years of comparison data, and that can be helpful to look at any trends that might be happening in your school division. And remember that the data is always submitted on February 1st of the year. The Virginia Department of Ed just submitted, in the process of submitting, the data for this year's collection.
And Liz, I had just one question, because we were talking about comparing data that DOE collects year to year. What about a school division that wants to compare data with another agency's data? What cautions should they be aware of?
Well, what's important is, and why we're spending the time to try to actually in a short amount of time, and we apologize for that, to understand how to look at your data. What are the parameters on your data set for the school division? And you need to have that same idea for other agencies. What are their definitions for employment, or what are their definitions of the individual? Because databases really function and are driven by what the definitions are. So you really need to get an idea and make sure that when you're comparing that you're talking about similar individuals, if you will, by definition, and similar ways that employment is counted.
Okay, so we're looking at not cumulative day, or we are looking at cumulative days for employment, whereas someone else might be looking at consecutive days of employment.
Exactly.
Some surveys look at enrollment, whereas we look at enrolled for a term. So those could really make databases or data sets look very different.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
Thank you.
Thank you for bringing that up. Again, we're back onto our website, and the arrow is pointing to see legacy data. When you click on that, you will get the years 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010, and after now the data is going in, 2011 will be put on that as we begin to collect the 2012 data.
Once you log in and you look at the reports that are available to you, you might determine that you need some additional very specific reports. For example, you might be interested in what the post-school outcomes look like for a specific disability category, or you might be interested in the outcomes for a group that exited school in a specific way. And those requests you would need to make through Paul Raskoff. He's the Director of Data and Finance in the Division of Special Education and Student Services. But when you're making that request through Mr. Raskoff, it would be helpful if you'd also copy in Liz Getzel and myself, and you do see all the contact information that you need on the slide. First, as we look at, this is just one of the data sets that we can look at through our reports. But before we look more closely at this, I just want to again caution that small n is always important, because your pool size of your respondents may skew what you're thinking. So that's always important to take that into consideration. Remember, percentages don't tell the whole story, particularly when you're working with a small n. You also, it might be helpful as you're looking at data to always be asking yourself, what is missing here, and does this represent our population that we want to look at? You also need to think about how many years worth of data do I really need to look at before I can determine I see a trend. It's helpful to know also what's going on in your community. For example, when you look at employment, one year the employment rates could be pretty depressed, and you might look back in your community and realize that one of your major employers has had cutbacks or has even left your area. You also need to consider things like budget and staffing challenges that not only you're facing, but that as school divisions face those, organizations in your community that provide support and services, other agencies that provide supports and services may also be looking at reduction in resources. So it's important to look at it, as you're analyzing your data and looking at it, to really consider more than just the numbers that you see on the paper.
If I could add something,
Yeah.
Marianne, another important thing to remember too is, and we talk about this, I talked to a number of school divisions about this, is your response rate. You need to look at how many people you were able to contact and get information. And looking at that number, it's almost like how many are you missing, if you will, and can you speak to the whole population based on the number that you have. Now, for Virginia total, the total state total with the completed survey is a representative sample. So you just want to look at to make sure that you are looking at numbers that are that do reflect your school population of leavers.
Okay, good. So lots of things to think about as you analyze and look at your data. We pulled this data from our favorite county, Jefferson County, and of course you all know your geography of Virginia and know that Jefferson County really doesn't exist, so fictitious county. And this data is pulled from a student record review. So someone is looking at the student's IEP record, and they're determining whether or not the student was referred to an outside agency. And you can see that 46% of the youth were referred to some agency or organization that could be helpful as the student exits school. Excuse me. 48% were not referred, or there's no record of any referral. And since agency linkage is an important part of transition, Jefferson County might want to consider looking at the non-referred or the no record of referral, that number, which is, what would you say, 48%. You might want to look at that population and determine, are they unengaged? I mean, is this the population of youngsters who they're not employed, they're not going on in school? You also might want to consider, even though that the student, maybe this was discussed with the student and family during a meeting, that they determined that they didn't need any referral, or they didn't need to use an additional agency. Maybe the student was going to be employed in a family business and they felt they really didn't need assistance. Or as they're moving into education or training program, they're doing so well in school that they feel they don't require any supports at that time. So it's helpful to know, maybe to look at the group that wasn't referred. And then another thing to look at too, as you look at some of the other referrals, like to the Employment Commission or to Social Security Administration or Community Service Board, is to consider, are you using all of the resources that are available to you in your community? So you could maybe you would be thinking, are we fully utilizing the services that are available to you through our workforce center? So there's lots of things to consider when you look at this, just this information that comes from a record review.
Which is at the front part of the survey, which is done when the individuals conducting the survey is filling in the demographic information of students, of potential contacts that you will be making, and then does a record review of agencies.
Now this report is actually from survey respondents, and again it's talking about what agencies were you referred to. And you can see that, if you add up some of the numbers, that 31% identified they were referred to an agency or an organization. But then look at the number that either don't know if they were referred, or they've responded that they were not referred to any linking agency. That's 65%. So you might ask yourself, just looking at those numbers, do the young people that we're working with know who's sitting at the table and helping them make some decisions? They may consider anybody who's at school, which is where most IEP meetings happen, that if you're at the school, then you must be part of the school division. So they might not recognize that someone's with another agency and that other person has some services that they can offer. So maybe Jefferson County, if they determine that young people really don't understand that whole linking process, they might want to consider how can they help students be more self-determined so that they take an even more active role in that whole process. This question and data that we get from the question just asks youngsters to tell us what classes they felt were most helpful to them. And you can see that they identified math, career and technical education courses, and English clearly as the leaders in this area. And that might be very good news to know that that in Jefferson County, the young people are seeing a really close connection between the classes they take and having good post-school outcomes. Now this question deals with what classes do you wish you had? So it's kind of now that I'm out of school and I've been out for a year and I'm doing whatever it is, college, training program, or employment, what things looking back do I wish I had taken? And again, we see that career and tech ed or computer-related courses account for 36% of the responses. Now, in Jefferson County, as they look at that data, they may think maybe we need to have some more career and tech ed offerings for our students. It could mean that they need to revisit a process for application or how they schedule students and when they schedule students to make sure that that students with IEPs have the same access to the application process as other students. They might also want to consider, should we have more collaboration with career and tech ed classes? It's quite common now in Virginia for the English class to have a collaborating teacher or a mathematics class to have a collaborating teacher, but it may not be a common practice for us to have collaborating teachers in our career and tech ed courses, and that may also be something to consider. So again, as you look at the data, typically what happens is it prompts you to ask some more questions and to mine your data a little deeper to come up with some conclusions. It's also helpful when you look at this data as you look at what are our course offerings going to look like in future years, and it may prompt a special ed director to request some more funding or to request that potential cuts not happen, knowing that students need more of a particular course offering so that they can have more successful outcomes.
As you can see on this table, students with specific learning disabilities is the larger group that's in college. We do have some students with intellectual disabilities that are counted. So Jefferson County may want to look at this to say, are there particular programs? Are we ensuring that individuals who say that they are interested in college and want to look at those options are facilitating that in their IEP meetings and working with students and families to make sure that that is happening, and to determine what are those higher education options and are there the academic preparation in place so that these students can then transition to these programs. Another question on the survey, if students, as you move through the survey and are getting responses, if a student indicates or a respondent indicates that currently they are not participating in 2 or 4 year programs, then it moves to post-secondary education or training programs. And there are specific definitions around this as well. There needs to be a formal application process for considering post-secondary education or training programs, and they also need to have completed a semester. Now, a semester for some of the programs that may be short-term education or employment, such as 10 weeks or that kind of thing, can be counted in this category. So we need to look at, in a sense, we have quite a high number that there's no participation. And we want to reflect on some of the information that Marianne was just talking about in terms of the need. They wish they had taken more vocational technical courses. We need to see if there is any connection at all in terms of what's happening to students who may want to go into more vocational technical coursework that could lead going into a vocational technical school or some other opportunity, or where they are in terms of completion of their diploma, so that we can see what's happening with individuals participating in post-secondary ed or training if the 2 or 4 year option is something that they do not want to pursue. The next is employment, and I just want to spend a little bit of time about employment. You will have on your database a table that is employment all settings. And this really helps to give you a picture of your respondent pool who are employed. And this includes individuals who may be in higher education and employed, which is really very much the trend now. Most students cannot go to afford college unless they are working. And it includes everyone by setting, and provides probably a better global picture of employment. Remember, your indicator 14 employment definition is competitive employment that that the student is earning at or above minimum wage, is working 20 hours a week or an average of 20 hours a week, and for 90 cumulative days since they've exited high school. And that can count as one job or more than one job when we're looking at that. This particular table shows you everyone. So your indicator 14, when you look at the non-duplicated count, you will see a number that says competitive employment. When you look at that number is the one that meets the indicator. And I've had questions from some school divisions about these employment numbers, because when you come to this table, it looks different. So Jefferson County would be looking at this table saying, how is our overall employment, and where are individuals going overall into employment, whether they're in college or not. And so it's important to look at the overall so that you do get that sense of what's happening in your school division employment-wise. And then you can look at your indicator number to look at those individuals that meet that definition, which means that they are earning minimum wage, they are in inclusive employment settings, that they are working a certain amount of hours, of 20 hours a week, and that it's been 90 cumulative days. So just bear in mind when you look at this employment that this will help you look at your overall global employment, but you may want to look at your indicator 14 number, because that is competitive employment and earning that minimum wage or above.
In this table, we're looking at who the student reports, or the graduate, the leaver, reports as having helped them find employment. And I always think this is an interesting table, because you can see clearly in Jefferson County, the majority of youngsters, I think it's 83% of them really are seeing they find their own job, a parent or relative helps them find the job, or a friend. So they're looking at some really close resources to them, helping them find work. And Jefferson County might want to think of this as, this is good news, that our youth are able to utilize those close resources that don't cost any money, and that's what's helping them find jobs. It could also indicate that we have some very self-reliant students, and of course those are all good things. But Jefferson County also might want to look at this and see how does this play into the whole idea of, again, the agency linkage. Because you do have a certain group here, that 6%, that they say someone else other than an agency or a friend or themselves helped them find a job, or they don't know who is helping them find a job. So they might want to, again, consider how we're providing information to youngsters during that IEP process when we're linking them to agencies that can assist them as they leave school. Then I think it's also interesting and very important that we look at what are the barriers to employment. Just as Liz will talk about the barriers to post-secondary education and training. So you can see from this table or this data set that the respondents are clearly identifying that there's a lack of jobs right now, and that makes it difficult. And we would expect somebody at an entry level who doesn't have a resume with lots of experience that they might experience more difficulty finding work. But we would again suspect that when there's a sluggish economy, because we know adults with a rich work history also can have difficulty finding employment. It's also important, again, for Jefferson County to look around in their community and recognize if they have a major employer that's left the area, that would be reflective in their employment rates. Another barrier that's identified by the respondents is transportation. So if Jefferson County doesn't have public transportation and they have some limited resources in that area, what might behoove school folks is to look at that and start working with youngsters even earlier and families to address the issue of transportation. And that involves a lot of problem solving or helping people who may not be used to looking around at a variety of resources, how they look and gather resources to help them get to work. I talked to a young man the other day on the phone, and he just got his driver's license, but he can't afford a car. He hasn't been working that long, but he does have employment. And so what he does is I'm sure it feels like he's scrambling sometimes, but if his mom is going off to work and it meets his work schedule, she drops him off. Maybe a fellow employee will bring him back home. Sometimes because he works shift work, he makes arrangements to meet somebody who works that same shift to get him to work and then also to get him home. So he's doing a lot of problem solving and thinking on his own, which is a good thing. But some youngsters are going to need some help with that, and some families are going to need some help with recognizing that there are a variety of ways to solve that transportation problem if you don't have public transportation. And then we also see that on this that 11% have health issues that are preventing them from going to work. We have a certain number that said that there were just a lack of programs that they were interested in. So a youngster who's interested in a culinary program or getting into video gaming, there might not be a program in their area. So again, they have to start to look at other resources or other options. And again, like I said, this again might link back to the school division and how they work with the agencies, the adult service agencies, how they do the linking, are they doing it early enough, and also what are the community resources and how they're looking at the community, all of the community resources to explore how they can be helpful.
I'm going to talk about the barriers to post-secondary education. What's important to remember is that the barriers to employment and barriers to post-secondary education, these are individuals who are, during this survey process, when you have called and talked with them, at that point in time, they are not in higher ed, they're not engaged in employment, and they're not involved in any other post-secondary education training or employment. So these individuals are the ones that when Jefferson County is looking at where are some of our issues or where are some of the barriers that still exist in our community, I know that for many of you in school divisions that these are very familiar issues and that you work on all the time. And when we look at barriers to post-secondary ed, the highest is lack of financial support. And I think that what we're finding and the work that we're doing in post-secondary ed is that it's really important that during the IEP process, students and their families have an idea of what financial opportunities are out there. And that is That is very difficult to track down all those options, but it is important at least to look at some primary resources, the federal government and their FAFSA forms, and some of the other opportunities in terms of scholarships that are geared to support students with disabilities and other means for assisting students, either Social Security. So looking at sort of that range of potential financial supports and making sure that in the planning process early on that doesn't become a primary barrier for students to be able to transition into some form of post-secondary education. Again, transportation comes up as an issue and is something that I know personally for some students that are attending VCU that the family works out their schedule and tries to work so that students are able to be on campus when there's not transportation from the particular county they live in to come into VCU. Again, we're looking at some similar situations and these individuals can select more than one of the barriers. So you may have an individual that has multiple barriers that's reflected in these numbers because individuals can check all that apply to them in terms of their barriers. Again, lack of programs or health issues becomes a problem, and lack of support services. Sometimes this involves the lack of support in terms of a personal assistant. I know that that's a big issue in post-secondary ed, looking and finding personal attendants to come on campus and to work with the student so the student can access post-secondary education. That's just one of a number of support services that could be an issue. And again, sort of the lack of affordable childcare, which can be a barrier both for employment and post-secondary ed.
For those of you who've been collecting the data with us for a couple of years, you know that we collect more information in our post-school survey than is required for the reporting purposes to the Office of Special Education Programs. But it's important that the data that we collect have some meaning, not just for reporting purposes, but that it's very useful for a school division to use to improve practices and when providing transition services so that we do see improved outcomes. If your division had an initiative to improve, let's say, the SOL scores, you naturally would look at instruction, who's not doing well, who is doing well, and this would help you begin to look at some of the practices that you might need to add more of or cease those practices and add something else that's evidence-based. So say Jefferson County decided that they wanted to increase the employment rate for students with intellectual disabilities. It might be important for them to see how leavers are accessing community supports or whether they are accessing community supports and resources. What courses are they taking while they're in high school that might lead to entry-level employment or the ability to be successful in a training program? It could also mean that they would want to add some more community-based programs like internships for students that are specifically designed for students with disabilities. So again, looking at having a lot of data that's helpful, that you can look deeper or mine your data a little deeper to look at specific populations, to look at specific initiatives that you might want to add that will improve, should improve anyway, your employment outcomes. And that would be the same with the post-secondary education and training programs.
Exactly. Again, we were talking about participation in higher ed by disability category, and Jefferson County could look at that and determine that they want to make sure that if post-secondary education is an outcome that the student and family would like to see happen, that during this IEP process that options are being looked at and information shared and ways to enhance that for any particular disability category that Jefferson County could be looking at. the overall participation, post-secondary education, other post-secondary education and training, I think is really important because for Jefferson County, they see a very large number not participating, and that could be that they're employed or that they are in higher ed, but I think need to look a little deeper in terms of what does that mean, and are there other options or initiatives that need to be discussed about employer-based training and providing further training beyond high school. Because as we know, more and more in this economy and the global market, that some post-secondary education, further training beyond high school will be needed by individuals who are exiting high school. And that's overall, and that includes all students who are exiting. So it becomes particularly important for students that we serve who have disabilities. And the non-engaged number, as Marianne pointed out, we do want to know what's happening to those individuals who are not employed at the time that you're contacting them, are not in higher ed, and in post-secondary education training. So what's happening with them? What's going on in their communities? And as we've said, that many of those themes are familiar to school divisions in terms of those issues, but really looking at who is impacted by these particular barriers, and what perhaps planning-wise, when we look at the numbers of agency referrals and what that means, it all really ties together. Your data tells a story, and it's a matter of understanding first and foremost what the data is you're looking at, so that you can then look at what that data story is and how to implement that into practice.
When we talk about students who identify that they're lacking support services in 2- and 4-year colleges, or even in employment settings, I wonder if a piece of that is that our students maybe are not comfortable identifying that they have a disability.
That's true.
And so that they would not receive supports if they're not asking for some additional assistance through the disability support services that are available. And that we know that those are some things that we can help students in school divisions, and even with agency referrals, people in agencies can be helpful in terms of identifying that there's a disability, the student or the person has a disability, and they need some additional assistance. So that can come through some self-determination work while they're still in high school, and I know that frequently agency folks are very helpful with helping a young person learn to identify disability in a very appropriate way, so they do receive some support services. So we probably could, with some additional work, Jefferson County could reduce that percentage, saying I can't get any support services. And another thing I would like to say, and that is that very much we thank teachers who have taken this collection very, very seriously and have done an outstanding job. So frequently I get calls, and I know Liz gets calls from teachers who have called a youngster who is at home. They've identified some barriers, why they're not doing, they're not employed, or they haven't gone on to school, and the teacher is able to reconnect that student so frequently with another agency that they were referred to maybe in high school but didn't follow through with meeting with that agency personnel, or they said they didn't want any referrals while they were in high school. They didn't want to do that, and the teachers have been able to really reconnect youngsters, and in some cases the youngster has even come back to school because they're still eligible for special education services. So I think it's important to really to emphasize the personal connections that teachers are making with past students, and that's really, I think, makes a difference to so many students.
Absolutely.
Okay, on this slide, this is just a contact information slide. You see there's Paul Raskoff, Liz Getzel, and myself, email and phone numbers for all three of us. If you have any additional comments, or you need some additional reports, you need some help with analyzing or looking at data with someone, that please feel free to call any one of us about those concerns you might have or questions you have. And I'd also like to remind you that we do have transition specialists at the VDOE training and technical assistance centers at Radford University, the College of William and Mary, James Madison University, George Mason University, and Virginia Commonwealth University. So all of our divisions have access to a lot of technical assistance to improve outcomes for children, and of course to improve the services that we're able to provide youngsters who have disabilities.
We would like to close by thanking you for your participation today, and please feel free to post any questions you have on the web board, and Marianne and I will respond to those questions as soon as we receive them. It may be at times, depending our time in the office, it may be 24 hours before we are able to respond, but we will respond to any questions that are posted on the web board. So thank you again.